Good evening and welcome. Tonight I'm going to be reading to you from this book about Tibet. And this video isn't about making any political statements. I'm not saying this, I'm not saying that. I'm just reading to you this book about the region known as Tibet. Since I've done a few other semi-autonomous areas in the world, I'm going to do it in the same format. So I'm going to read to you, look how beautiful. Read to you the introduction, and then we'll read all the little boxes and look at all the pictures. So, Tibet today. A record-breaking 20 million tourists visited Tibet in 2015, producing some $4.26 billion in tourism revenue. Even though the Chinese government regularly closes Tibet to overseas travelers for 5 weeks each spring, spanning the anniversary of the 2008 riots in the Tibetan capital Lhasa, and occasionally at other times of periodic unrest, tourism is booming. Why are millions of people flocking to Tibet? What are they hoping to find there? For one thing, there's the spectacular scenery. This is the land of the world's highest mountains. Most people find the vistas to be absolutely breathtaking, but in more ways than one. The Tibetan Plateau is the highest region on Earth, with an average altitude of 14,760 feet. Even the capital city, Lhasa, which sits at nearly 12,000 feet, is plenty high enough to cause altitude sickness in visitors who haven't taken the time to acclimate, and even in some who have. The air at such heights is thinner, meaning it has less oxygen, and the body tries to compensate by working harder to get oxygen. The heart pumps faster, and breathing is rapid and shallow. Tourists are advised to spend at least 3 to 5 days at an altitude between 8,000 and 9,000 feet before heading higher, so their bodies have time to adjust, but not all tourists want to take the time. Altitude sickness, also called acute mountain sickness, can be extremely unpleasant, typically causing a throbbing headache, nausea, exhaustion, and dizziness. Who wants to spend their vacation feeling like that? Evidently, millions of people are willing to risk altitude sickness, or are willing to add extra time to their travels in order to avoid it. Either way, the region's geography makes visiting more difficult, and snow-capped mountains can be seen at safer altitudes elsewhere. Therefore, something else must draw people to this high, forbidding land. Tibet has long been regarded as an almost magical place, where people seem to exist on a higher plane, spiritually as well as geographically. Because of its long history of isolation, it's seen as a mysterious, exotic world unlike anywhere else. Buddhism infuses the local culture with a deep sense of serenity and peace that attracts seekers hoping to find an authentic experience. How then to square that image with the reality of monks burning themselves to death in public places to protest Tibet's oppressive rulers? Something must be profoundly wrong in this magical land. Since 2009, more than 140 Tibetans have self-immolated in protest against Chinese authority. The gruesome protests are intended to call international attention to Tibet's political status as an occupied country, whose language and culture are being systematically destroyed. But is Tibet a country? China insists it is not. Tibet is an administrative region of the People's Republic of China, or the PRC. The United States and most other countries officially agree. Since 1950, Tibet, or the Tibet Autonomous Region, or the TAR, has been a part of China, not a country unto itself. Yet there is another Tibet. Spanning the vast Tibetan Plateau in Central Asia and East Asia, it is the traditional homeland of the Tibetan people. Geographically, this Tibet includes the official Chinese TAR, but is roughly twice as large. This homeland is claimed by the Tibetan government in exile as the country of Tibet. This population includes more than 1 million Tibetans living in exile outside its borders, mostly in India and Nepal. China has little patience with this group of exiles and their claims. The exile community looks to Tenzin Gyatso, the 14th Dalai Lama, who is, right here, an international personality and a symbol for peace. In 2013, a survey of people in the United States and the 5 largest European nations found the Dalai Lama to be one of the 3 most popular leaders in the world, on par with Pope Francis and U.S. President Barack Obama. In 1959, the Dalai Lama led some 100,000 Tibetans out of their homeland to Dharamsala, India, to escape the Chinese, and he has never been allowed back home since. He continues to call for self-rule in his old country. The Chinese are not fans of the Dalai Lama, to put it mildly. Officials and media constantly refer to him as a splittist who is trying to incite revolution and violence. The U.S. State Department has urged China to allow Tibetans to express grievances freely, while calling on Tibetans to end self-immolations. Even the Dalai Lama has questioned the effectiveness of the protests, though he points out that dissenting Tibetans could have easily hurt other people, but instead were choosing to sacrifice their own lives, not hurting others, in protest. The Chinese, however, will have none of it. Chinese intentions in Tibet, from their point of view, are for the best. Trying to win American sympathy, Chinese officials have compared themselves to U.S. President Abraham Lincoln. China freed the slaves, they say, referring to the harsh feudal system that existed in Tibet when China took over the country in 1950. Since then, China has been working hard to modernize the once isolated, technologically backward country. Bringing Chinese culture to backward Tibet is a gift, from the Chinese point of view. They have merely brought Tibet back into the loving embrace of motherland China, where it rightfully belongs. However, some Western historians suggest a very different analogy to America's past. The experience of the Tibetans at the hands of the Chinese, they say, is like that of the Native Americans in the face of European settlers centuries ago. After all, the Europeans who first came to the Americas believed they were bringing a superior culture to a backward people, and if the gift needed to be bestowed with an iron hand, then so be it. The natives would find themselves better off for it, they reasoned. In the American history analogy, the Europeans believed they were saving the souls of the natives by forcing them to accept Christianity. The communist Chinese model in Tibet was quite the opposite at first, with the government seeking to eliminate all religion. In the 1960s, Buddhist monasteries and temples were quite literally destroyed, and with it, the Chinese hoped, the Tibetans' Buddhism-based culture. But the Chinese underestimated the depth of the Tibetans' attachment to Buddhism. Today, the Chinese authorities are more accepting of Buddhism in Tibet, as well as in the rest of China. Certainly, the Chinese government recognizes the value of Tibet as a tourist attraction, and to that end has been rebuilding monasteries and encouraging elements of Tibetan culture. However, Tibetan exiles, and those sympathetic to them, charge that China is creating a sort of Disney World version of Tibet, a sort of inauthentic Shangri-La, to suit the fantasies of tourists. As long as the pretense of paradise prevails, those observers say, the world will be willing to look the other way at China's human rights abuses and its obliteration of a country, a culture, and a people. So that's about the situation in Tibet. Thankfully, it has a very beautiful landscape and amazing mountains. More gorgeous scenery. This is Lake Namtso, Heavenly Lake, it says. Let's read about Mount Everest. Here we go. Chomolungma, or Goddess Mother of the World, as the Tibetans call Mount Everest, is the highest peak on Earth at 29,035 feet above sea level. Named after Sir George Everest, the Surveyor General of India who first recorded the location and height of the mountain, it lies on the border between Tibet and Nepal. Attempts to climb the mountain began in 1920 with the opening of the Tibetan Access Route. However, high altitudes, wind, and cold air resulted not only in failed expeditions, but deaths as well. Tibetan monks were initially reluctant to allow climbers to use the Tibetan route, fearful that the gods of the mountain would kill them. Today, paintings still remain in the now deserted monasteries that depict the fate of the monks, believed would befall anyone who set foot on the mountain. When China closed its doors to the outside world in 1951, routes through Nepal were sought. In 1953, Edmund Hillary of New Zealand and Tenzing Norgay of Nepal reached the summit from the southeast ridge. After their success, many more adventurers followed in their footsteps. Today, there is a long waiting list of groups wishing to attempt to reach the top, but only a limited number of teams can make the ascent each year because the climbing season is so short and there are very few safe locations for base camps. By 2012, more than 500 people had reached the summit of Mount Everest, but as of 2016, nearly 280 people have perished on the trek. Climbers die mostly due to avalanches, falls, exposure, or other health problems brought on by extreme conditions on the mountain, including heart attack and high-altitude cerebral edema. Because of the danger and difficulty of retrieving bodies on Everest, people who die on the mountain usually remain there. Here's the Yarlung Tsangpo River and Canyon. Tibet's major waterway, the Yarlung Tsangpo River, is the highest major river in the world. It originates in western Tibet and travels eastward through the South Tibet Valley. It winds through sandbanks, splitting and reforming again, until it reaches Namcha Barwa, a mountain in the east of Tibet. There it makes a sharp horseshoe turn and runs south into Bangladesh as the Brahmaputra River. This horseshoe bend in the river forms the Yarlung Tsangpo Grand Canyon, the deepest and possibly the longest canyon in the world. The canyon plunges 19,714 feet at its lowest point, and at 314 miles long, it is longer than the Grand Canyon in the United States. As the river flows through the gorge, it is sometimes called the Everest of rivers because of its extreme conditions as it drops some 11,000 feet. Explorers once thought that the sharp drop in altitude was the result of an enormous waterfall. But in 1924, the river was completely mapped and no falls over 30 feet were recorded. Instead, the river descends through a series of rapids where the water travels at about 33 feet per second. Here's the city of Lhasa, the capital. And let's read about Tibet's World Heritage Sites. Lhasa is the location of 3 UNESCO World Heritage Sites, which are recognized as one grouping called the Historic Ensemble of the Potala Palace. For purposes of protection and preservation, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization identifies places of cultural and natural heritage around the world that it determines to be of outstanding value to humanity. The Potala Palace itself is a complex atop Red Mountain which dates to 1645. It was built on the site of an earlier palace constructed in the 7th century, which was the winter residence of the Dalai Lamas and until the 14th Dalai Lama fled the country in 1959. About a mile away, the palace of Norbalinka sits on the banks of the Lhasa River in a lush garden environment. It was built in 1755 by the 7th Dalai Lama and served as the traditional summer residence of the Dalai Lamas. In Tibetan, the name Norbalinka means treasure garden or treasure park. In the Old Town section of Lhasa, the Jokang Temple Monastery is the 3rd site within the World Heritage Historic Ensemble. Many Tibetans consider this building, which dates to 652, to be the most sacred temple in Tibet. According to UNESCO, the 3 sites together, with their rich ornamentation and harmonious integration in a striking landscape, exhibit the distinctive characteristics of traditional Tibetan architecture and have outstanding universal value. Oh wow, Yambulagang Palace. That is gorgeous. And let's see, Tibetan King Songtsen Gampo and the Jokang Temple. The Tibetan Empire in the late 700s. It stretched very, very far. There you go. It stretched very far. And here's a box about the rise of the Yellow Hats. While all the political wrangling was going on between the various Buddhist sects during the 14th and 15th centuries, a new Buddhist religious order was emerging. This was the Gelugpa, or Gelug school, meaning the virtuous tradition, which is sometimes called the Yellow Hats. The leader of this sect, Gendon Drupa, testified that when he died, his soul would rise in reincarnation to lead the Yellow Hats. In 1578, the third incarnation, Sonam Gyatso, was invited to visit the Mongol ruler, who gave him the title Dalai Lama, or Ocean of Wisdom. The Mongol Empire had declined to some extent, but Mongolia still existed as a potential threat to rival groups in Tibet. With the backing of neighboring Mongolia, the Yellow Hats entered the political arena, and in 1642, the fifth Dalai Lama, Lobsang Gyatso, became the political and spiritual leader of Tibet. This order of Buddhists would control Tibet until the invasion of China in 1950. And here we see some Buddhists being taken away by Chinese soldiers. And let's read about the Free Tibet movement. Internationally, many people consider Tibet an occupied country, and there are numerous organizations dedicated to the need to free Tibet. A non-profit organization called Free Tibet, started in 1987 in London, is one such group. Others include the International Campaign for Tibet, established in 1988, and Students for a Free Tibet, founded in 1994 in New York City. These groups and others like them work to raise awareness in the West of China's alleged human rights abuses in Tibet. They pressure China for the release of Tibetan political prisoners. They also encourage cultural resistance among the Tibetan people, cooperate with the exiled Dalai Lama, and work to report unfiltered news from inside Tibet. Let's see, there's Potala Palace there. And some delegates from Tibet in Beijing. Let's read about the government in exile. Let me start down here. When the Dalai Lama fled Tibet for India in 1959, nearly 100,000 Tibetans joined him in the months that followed. The community of refugees was granted political asylum by the Indian government, but was refused international aid for fear of escalating the Cold War already at its height. The Dalai Lama appealed for international aid on several occasions. Eventually, the United Nations demanded respect for human rights of the Tibetan people. Turning to the Buddhist precepts of patience and endurance, the Dalai Lama established a community of learning in Dharamsala, while waiting for the day when he could return to his people in Tibet. Monasteries and Tibetan Buddhist schools are currently fully active. They also welcome visitors and students from Tibet and other countries. The Dalai Lama resigned his political duties in 2011, but the government in exile continues. Today it is called the Central Tibetan Administration, or CTA, headed by the Kalan Tripa, or Prime Minister, Lobsang Sangay, who was elected in 2011. The CTA has a government-like structure with a cabinet of ministers, a parliament, and democratic elections held every 5 years. However, it is not recognized as a sovereign government by any country, and the CTA itself claims its mission is not to take power in Tibet. Rather, it will dissolve itself as soon as freedom is restored in Tibet, and a new government is formed inside the country by Tibetans themselves. Meanwhile, the CTA oversees the welfare of the Tibetan exile community in India, who number about 100,000. Some 1,000 refugees flee to this community each year from China, usually by way of Nepal. A big tunnel being built. Looks like the big ceremony opening it up. First car driving through. Here's a big power station. Songmu Hydropower Station. And a gorgeous farm. Look how beautiful that picture is. Let's read about yaks. Yaks are native to the Central Asian Plateau. The vast majority of yaks are found in the Himalaya region and farther north toward Mongolia and Russia. Wild male yaks are about 6.5 feet high at the shoulder and weigh up to about 2,200 pounds. They are covered with long black or brown hair and have long horns and a hump on their shoulders. They are well adapted to high altitudes and have larger lungs and hearts than other kinds of cattle. Domesticated yaks are smaller, and their coats range from black to red or white. They are enormously useful to the Tibetans. These animals produce rich milk that can be made into cheese and butter. The butter can also be used as fuel. The meat is eaten raw, dried, or roasted. The bones are made into jewelry or utensils, and the hide and fur can be fashioned into clothing, rope, boats, or tents. A jo, a cross between a yak and a cow, is a smaller, more docile animal often used to pull plows. Never heard of a cross between a cow and a yak. Look at this gorgeous up-close picture of a snow leopard. It's really beautiful. And there's a Baral, Himalayan blue sheep. It's really cute. And sadly over here there's some tiger skins that have been taken from poachers, but I don't think I want to show you that because it's very, very, very sad. So you can just imagine. Let's read about the Tibetan antelope. Which, look at this pattern on its face. It's really beautiful. The Tibetan antelope, or chiru, lives in the high altitudes of the Tibetan Plateau. Unfortunately for this native Tibetan mammal, it has an extremely soft wool undercoat called chatouche, which can be woven into luxurious textiles. Shawls made from this material are highly prized and can sell internationally for thousands of dollars. During the last 2 decades of the 20th century, the chiru population declined by more than 50%, and the species is now endangered. Much of this decline is due to poaching for its fur. Although the animal's fur can be obtained without killing it, poachers find it faster and easier simply to kill the creature. It takes about 4 chiru to make 1 shawl. Today, the selling of products containing chatouche is illegal, but of course it still occurs. It's a nice face there. Oh, even better, we've got Grandma here out in the field. And milking a yak. And these are refugee children in Nepal, it says. And a, let's see, Tibetan woman in Gari Prefecture wearing beautiful, beautiful traditional clothing. Here's some Buddhists, some monks. And this is around the Jokang Temple. It's a really gorgeous neighborhood. And here's a traditional countryside house. And here's inside a traditional shelter. It says like a yurt, looks like. And weaving, it says. Some beautiful cloth there. You can kind of see it taking shape down there. It's really pretty green. Working hard in school. There's the Dalai Lama. Let's see what else we have. Some beautiful prayer wheels. And here they are in action. You spin them. Let the mantras go out into the world. Look at this. The Wheel of Life. What a fantastic religious artwork here. Let's read about the Panchen Lama, which it doesn't say in here, but the Panchen Lama is, oh, jeez, okay, 24, let's see. That scared me. Turn on this light quick. Maybe that'll help. My poor eyes. Not really. The Panchen Lama is the person that goes out and finds the next Dalai Lama. So let's read about the Panchen Lama. The Panchen Lama is second only to the Dalai Lama in religious authority for the Gelugpa school of Tibetan Buddhism. The first incarnation of the Panchen Lama was born in the 14th century His reincarnations continued unhindered until the death of the 9th Lama in 1937. It was not until 1950, 13 years after his death, that 2 Tibetan candidates were discovered. Relations between the Chinese and the Tibetans had been deteriorating, so when the Chinese put forward a candidate, the Tibetans feared the political situation would worsen if he were turned down. Despite the fact that traditional tests were not administered, the Chinese candidate gradually came to be accepted as the true incarnation. He was taken to Beijing at the age of 14, where his training and education were strictly controlled by the Chinese government. After the Dalai Lama fled Tibet in 1959, the Panchen Lama was declared the political and spiritual leader of Tibet. When he was allowed to return to Tibet, he declared his allegiance to the Dalai Lama and was subsequently arrested. He spent years in Chinese prisons and was only pardoned in the late 1970s. His death in 1989 sparked a search for his incarnation. In 1995, the Dalai Lama announced the discovery of a 6-year-old Panchen Lama. The Chinese authorities took the boy into their custody, and nobody except the Chinese government knows of his whereabouts today. Not long afterward, the Chinese conferred the title of Panchen Lama on their own candidate, Gyaltsen Norbu. The dispute over the disappearance of the missing Panchen Lama, as well as the legitimacy of the Chinese candidate, remains unresolved. Let's see, 17th Karmapa, leading a prayer there, and let's read about the sacred mandala. I hesitate because I used to have a friend named Mandala, so if I slip and say mandala, it was spelled the same way too. I apologize, but it's pronounced mandala. The Buddhist cosmos is often depicted in mandalas, which are complex patterns of squares and circles in perfect radial symmetry. They can be created in paint and 3-dimensional architecture, but are often formed with grains of colored sand, an ancient art form. Tibetan Buddhist monks use mandalas to aid meditation. The word mandala comes from Sanskrit, meaning circle. Designs based on radial symmetry, which is symmetry around a central axis, are important in both Hinduism and Buddhism, but also appear in Christian art, such as in stained glass rose windows in cathedrals. A Tibetan Buddhist mandala is more than just a design, however. Everything about the sacred mandala, its colors, patterns, and imagery, is symbolic of a perfectly harmonious universe and exhibits the wisdom of enlightenment. Look at that one. Oh, that's beautiful. Monks skilled in making mandalas sometimes spend weeks creating one out of sand on a tabletop or on the ground outside a monastery. Creating a sand mandala is said to aid purification and healing on several levels. Typically, a mandala is divided into 4 quadrants, and 4 monks work together, each on his own quadrant. The creation begins with a ceremony of music and chanting. The artists then draw the design using white chalk, a straight-edged ruler, and a compass. The process can take about 3 hours. At that point, the artists begin in the center and work outward, using colored sands poured through a narrow funnel-shaped tool called a chalk pour. One of the important aspects of a sand mandala is its impermanence, which is itself a central tenet of Buddhism. After spending weeks, perhaps, making a magnificent and intricate work of art, the creator destroys it by brushing all the sand together. Traditionally, the sands are then spilled into a stream to spread the blessings of the mandala. The deconstruction is a fitting demonstration of the impermanence of all things. Isn't that incredible? And then there's some beautiful mani stones, painted stones there too. It's so neat. Studying some ancient scripts there. Ooh, writing in Tibetan, isn't that a beautiful script? And look at this, a beautiful mantra all painted. Let's read about pinyin. In order to make Chinese intelligible to non-Chinese speakers, a method called pinyin was developed to transliterate Chinese into Roman characters. But pinyin must be supplemented by a series of stress marks indicating the correct tone. The original phonetic transcription was changed later, causing some confusion among foreigners. Using pinyin, the old form Peking becomes Beijing, Mao Zedong becomes Mao Zedong, and Canton becomes Guangzhou. In the 1950s, Chinese characters replaced Tibetan place names. The characters chosen for each place were those that most resembled Tibetan pronunciation. When Tibetan words are then transcribed into pinyin for an English speaker, the difference between the original Tibetan and pinyin is even greater. For example, one of the monasteries in Tibet is called Tashul Humpo, a literal translation from the sound of the Tibetan word. But when it is translated to Chinese characters and further transcribed into pinyin, it reads Jia Shul Hunbo, which in red sounds nothing like the original word. Working on a woodblock carving there. And some type being used there to make some manuscripts. Look how gorgeous. Beautiful, beautiful monastery with the mountain in the background. Oh, Tangka. Isn't that gorgeous? Look at the details in this art. I love it. And a beautiful Buddha statue. Let's read about Milarepa. There we go. Born in 1040 to a family of middle-ranking nobles, Milarepa had every prospect of becoming a wealthy nobleman. But when his father died, the estate passed into his uncle's hands until Milarepa came of age. The unscrupulous uncle took the estate for himself and forced Milarepa's mother, brothers, and sisters to become his servants. Milarepa's mother had a tiny piece of property of her own. She sold the land in order to buy an education in black magic for Milarepa so that he could avenge his family. Mastering the dark arts, Milarepa killed his uncle's eldest son and several others by willing the roof of a house to fall on them. He caused hailstorms to ruin his uncle's crops. When the uncle finally returned Milarepa's property, Milarepa was so overcome by sorrow and guilt at what he had done that he gave up his property and went in search of a holy teacher. As penance, he was instructed by his teacher to build and then destroy a tower over and over again. Then his teacher advised him to become a monk and to live a life of contemplation. Milarepa lived for many years in a cave where he developed magical powers. Later in life, he wrote some of Tibet's most well-loved poetry and is now regarded as a Buddhist saint. What a story. Oh, it's the abominable snowman. A mythological figure. Speaking of mythology, let's read about Shangri-La. British writer James Hilton never traveled to Tibet, but he was inspired by the eastern explorations of Joseph Rock. The Austrian-American botanist wrote numerous articles for National Geographic magazine in the 1920s. In Hilton's novel, the main character, British World War I veteran Hugh Conway, survives a plane crash in the mountains of Tibet. He and 3 other survivors find their way to a lamasery, which is a Tibetan Buddhist monastery, in the magical valley of Shangri-La. In that idyllic and peaceful place, the body's aging slows down significantly, and people live to be hundreds of years old. The book was made into a movie by Frank Capra in 1937. The story of Shangri-La entranced Western audiences with its hints of Eastern mysticism and exotic locale. Eventually, the name Shangri-La itself came to mean a utopia, or paradise, or state of pure happiness and love, particularly one hidden from civilization and imbued with magical qualities. Today, many Westerners associate Shangri-La with Tibet, and certain tourist attractions in the region play to that fantasy. Ooh, this is cool. Some Cham dancers, it says, and incredible masks. He's ready to play some soccer. And let's see, they're chanting some Buddhist sutras together in the park. That sounds quite nice. Let's read about yak racing. Wow. Sounds very thrilling, doesn't it? In addition to supplying food and livelihoods for many Tibetans, yaks also provide entertainment. Yak races are popular competitions at traditional festivals, particularly horse festivals. As in a horse race, a rider sits astride his yak and spurs it on to run the course. Yaks can run very quickly over short distances, making for quite a show as 10 or 12 dash across an open field. The races can be dangerous as yaks can respond unexpectedly to the cheers of the crowd and the proximity of competing yaks. To add to the spectacle, the animals are decorated with red silks, flowers, and ornate saddles, and their riders are adorned with brightly colored costumes. Race winners take home a bit of money, as well as respect and admiration. And there's some rickshaws you can see there. Downtown Lhasa, it says. Now that's a great photo, isn't it? It's on Surf Emancipation Day. And some fireworks here for New Year's. Potala Palace. Wow. Look at these conch shells, they're gigantic. Celebrating Tibetan New Year, it says. And a big festival, Monlam Festival, they're all praying together. It's another very striking picture, isn't it? Same with this, the Festival of Lamps. That's so beautiful. It seems like a very spiritual thing, or like a spiritual event. Lots of dried little snacks and nuts here. Oh boy, look at all this yak butter. So much yak butter. It's so yellow too, isn't it? And there's a bunch of yak meat as well. Sampa balls. Let's see, what's a sampa ball? Does it say here? It's probably on the other page. Darn. Looks tasty though. And they're working in the fields there. Looks like a rice field. Oh no, it's barley. Barley field. Tibetan dumplings called momos. Sounds very good. And then we have some more dishes. Tibetan sweet rice. Some cashews on top. Yum yum. And this is Tibetan butter tea. Now that sounds really delectable. Very like creamy, doesn't it? And here's a map of Tibet and about where it's located in the world. And that's going to be it for tonight. So thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found this video relaxing and educational. And I hope that you have a very good